would say there were two major reasons. I spent 7 years in the Middle East, much of that time covering Gaza. I was based in Cairo. The Jerusalem bureau for the New York Times did not really cover Gaza. They made very little effort to cover Gaza. So I would be sent from Cairo and live in Gaza for weeks at a time. I was very frustrated with the way the New York Times covered Palestine. And the way they did it, which was different. I went on to cover the war in Yugoslavia, for instance, and it wasn't like this at all. So if I was reporting on, let's say, an airstrike on a refugee camp in Jabalia or somewhere else, they would pepper the article with, I may have been interviewing an eyewitness, but then immediately would be followed with a different account coming from the IDF out of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or somewhere. It had the effect of essentially neutralizing the story. By the end of the story, you could believe whatever you wanted to believe. And that was very difficult. Finally, in frustration, I used my vacation time to go to Gaza to write an article called A Gaza Diary, where I spent 10 days living in the refugee camp of Han Yunis with a great cartoonist, Joe Sacco, who wrote Palestine, footnotes in Gaza. And I said, I'm not going to interview any official. I'm not going to interview any PLO official. I'm not going to interview Hamas officials. I'm just going to write day by day what it's like in this refugee camp. And it was an eruption at the Times when it was printed. And I was told, although I'm an Arabic speaker, I think they only had 2 or 3 at the paper at the time, that I would never cover the Middle East again. So that was the first blow. The second blow was the call to invade Iraq. I had spent a lot of time in Iraq. I had not only had gone into Kuwait in the first Gulf War I was not embedded. I was what they called a unilateral, which meant that I wasn't a part of any military pool, but I had grafted onto a Marine Corps unit, gone into Kuwait with them, and then stayed on in the Middle East for the New York Times, covering the destruction of the stockpiles. And Saddam Hussein had stockpiles of chemical weapons, mostly in artillery shells. So I covered all of that. I knew he might have had a tiny residue, but I knew he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. I knew it was a lie. I knew the whole premise of invading Iraq, which of course had nothing to do with 9/11, was the fiasco it became. Certainly up until Gaza, the greatest war crime. I mean, you have to go back to Vietnam or something. And I couldn't keep quiet about that. So I spoke very publicly on big media programs. And that angered the New York Times, especially after I was booed off of a commencement stage. And I was given a formal written reprimand from the paper. Under Guild rules, you get the reprimand in writing. I was called into the office of an assistant managing editor, Bill Schmidt, and given the reprimand, presented with the reprimand. And then if I violated that reprimand, i.e. I continued to speak about the war, then I, under Guild rules, could be fired. And I wasn't going to stop speaking about the war. And that ended my career at the New York Times.
The debate that is just eternal that people on the left and right have is over the bias of the New York Times. What is the ideological posture of the New York Times? Conservatives eternally insist that it's some left liberal bias or whatever. And then you have people on the left or even liberals who insist that it has this kind of institutional conservative bias. And, for me, I've always thought that the ideology of the New York Times is kind of allegiance to the foreign policy community, the U.S. security state, and it's hard to, especially these days, place that on the left or the right. But I'm wondering, and I think there's a lot of people who haven't lived through that history of 9/11, post 9/11, the Iraq War, or people who just did but decided to forget about it. But in those instances where the New York Times was diluting your stories, basically negating the things you're reporting with IDF statements, giving them equal weight, and then especially with this idea that you somehow couldn't speak out against the Iraq War, even though many, many New York Times journalists were free to speak out in favor of it and were absolutely doing that. Would you say that the reason was that the Sulzberger family or the New York Times just institutionally has this ideological bias, say, in favor of Israel, in favor of wars? Or was it more just the kind of post 9/11 uber jingoism that prevailed where, pretty much a lot of people, I would say the majority of people in corporate media, decided that their patriotic duty was to align with the war on terror, post 9/11 policies of the U.S. government.
I would say it's both. The New York Times, think of the New York Times as the ideology of the New York Times as being Cold War liberalism, which is different from traditional liberalism, which used to be, if you go back to Henry Wallace, or maybe the last figure being George McGovern, was confronted the military establishment and military adventurism and the arms industry and they're always a cheerleader for war, whatever war it is. Of course, as you know, after 9/11, the entire country drank that very dark elixir of nationalism and revenge, so that my outspokenness against the war led to repeated death threats. I would come into my desk at the New York Times, and the message bank on the phone was completely full of death threats. And the only reason there weren't more is because they ran out of space. I also got written death threats, bomb threats, all this kind of stuff. So you know as very well that was a very difficult time to speak out against the war. I just want to say that if this wasn't an opinion, I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I had detailed knowledge of what had happened in the aftermath of the first Gulf War in Iraq. I understood that Iraq was not only no longer a threat to its neighbors, it certainly wasn't a threat to us. I had covered 9/11 and knew that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. So all of this essentially, these kinds of fact-based statements became an anathema. I would also say that my colleagues who covered the Middle East, their opinion was no different from mine, but they were careerists. And I think many, many, many people, George Packer, all these kinds of figures, became cheerleaders for the war, and they don't know anything about the Middle East. But it doesn't matter. They know what's good for their career. Careerism is the primary disease at a place like the New York Times. There's nothing written on the wall that you can't say this or you can't say that, but you intuit. You understand very quickly the kinds of things that will advance your career in terms of what you report on and how you report it, and the kinds of things that won't. And I would cite the coverage of the student protests across the country against the genocide in Gaza. It was appalling. I mean, they painted these students, and I spent time at the encampment in Columbia and Princeton. I mean, these students were not anti-Semitic. A fairly significant percentage of them were Jewish. You would have these very moving moments on Friday nights where they would have Muslim prayers, and then on the same tarp they would have Shabbat. But the New York Times, I think, was guilty essentially by seeking out Zionist students and mischaracterizing the movement. I mean, the coverage was appalling. But that caters to the establishment. The reporters who are sent up there, they know what the editors want. They don't want to be a management headache. So yeah, I think it's Cold War liberalism, and then it's a pretty knee-jerk response in terms of its support of Israel. Yeah, yeah, and to write any kind of fact-based narrative out of the West Bank or Gaza. I speak as someone who did it for 7 years. It was a constant battle.